Right now, wherever you are, look at your hands. Go ahead, actually do it. Notice which one you'd use to write your name, throw a ball, hold a fork. For most of you, it's the right hand. Feels natural, automatic, like there's no other way it could be. But for about 1 in 10 people watching this, it's the left hand. And here's the thing that should keep you up at night, except you're probably trying to fall asleep, so maybe it won't. That 1 in 10 ratio, it shouldn't exist. Evolution is ruthless, brutally efficient. If a trait reduces your chances of survival or reproduction, even slightly, natural selection eliminates it. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but it always eliminates it eventually. That's how evolution works. It's not personal, it's just math. Traits that help you survive spread through the population. Traits that hurt you disappear. Simple. Except left-handedness hasn't disappeared. It's been around for at least 500,000 years, probably longer. Cave paintings show it. Ancient tools prove it. Fossilized teeth where patterns reveal it. And the ratio has remained weirdly stable. Around 10% of humans, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, born with a preference that puts them at a disadvantage in a world designed by and for the 90% majority. Think about what that means. For hundreds of thousands of years, left-handed people have been using tools that don't fit their grip, writing in directions that smudge their work, fighting with weapons balanced for the opposite hand. In medieval Europe, they were suspected of witchcraft. In 20th century schools, they had their left hands tied behind their backs. Even today, they're more likely to die in accidents involving machinery designed for right-handers. Evolution should have stamped this out. The trait should have faded away tens of thousands of years ago, lost in the brutal calculus of survival. But it didn't. It's still here. You're still here if you're left-handed. 1 in 10, steady as a heartbeat, across every culture, every continent, every era of human history. So what's going on? Why does left-handedness persist when it seemingly shouldn't? That's the mystery we're about to explore. From prehistoric handprints on cave walls to cutting-edge brain scans, from ancient Roman stigma to modern athletic advantages, from forced childhood conversions to the scientists still trying to figure out what actually causes handedness in the first place. This is a story about evolution, neuroscience, persecution, and the beautiful stubbornness of biology that refuses to follow the rules we expect. And if you want to dive even deeper into prehistoric human mysteries like this one, we've just released a book exploring the secrets written in our ancient past, available at sleepytimehistory.com. But first, we need to ask the most basic question. The one that turns out to be far harder to answer than you'd think. What actually makes someone left-handed? You'd think after thousands of years of wondering about this, we'd have a simple answer. We've mapped the human genome, we've photographed black holes, we've figured out how life evolved from single cells into everything walking, swimming, and flying around the planet today. But ask a neuroscientist why your friend picks up a pen with their left hand instead of their right, and you'll get a surprisingly unsatisfying answer. Because we still don't really know. Let's start with what we do understand. Your brain is split into 2 hemispheres, left and right. And here's where it gets weird. They're crossed. Your left hemisphere controls the right side of your body. Your right hemisphere controls the left side. This isn't some random accident of biology. It's true for every mammal, every bird, even fish show this pattern. Somewhere deep in evolutionary history, probably before our ancestors even crawled onto land, this crossing of neural pathways became fundamental to how vertebrate nervous systems work. For most people, about 90%, the left hemisphere is dominant for language and fine motor control. This hemisphere drives the right hand, making them right-handed. Left-handed people supposedly have the reverse pattern, right hemisphere dominance driving left-hand preference. Clean, simple, symmetrical. Except it's not that simple. Brain scans reveal that about 70% of left-handers still have left hemisphere language dominance, just like right-handers. Their brains aren't just mirror images. They're doing something different, something we're still trying to map. Handedness isn't a simple switch. It's a window into brain organization, and the view is more complicated than anyone expected. So maybe it's genetic. That was the obvious next question. After all, left-handedness runs in families. 2 right-handed parents have about a 10% chance of having a left-handed child, matching the general population. But if one parent is left-handed, that jumps to about 20%. 2 left-handed parents, around 26%. Clearly genes matter, but there's no left-handed gene. Researchers have been looking for decades. They've scanned the genomes of hundreds of thousands of people, right-handers and left-handers, searching for the genetic difference that explains handedness. What they found instead was a mess. Not one gene, not two, but dozens, maybe hundreds, each contributing a tiny nudge in one direction or the other. Think of it like height. No single gene makes you tall. Instead, hundreds of genetic variants each add or subtract a millimeter here, a centimeter there. Your final height is the sum of all these tiny influences, plus environmental factors like nutrition during childhood. Handedness works the same way. Genes create a probability, not a destiny. They push you gently toward left or right, but they don't determine which hand you'll favor. This explains something that really puzzled early researchers. Identical twins. Same DNA, same womb environment, often raised in nearly identical conditions. If handedness were purely genetic, identical twins should always have the same handedness. But they don't. Studies show that if one identical twin is left-handed, the other twin only has about a 25% chance of also being left-handed. That's higher than the general population, showing genes do matter, but it's nowhere near 100%. Something else is going on. That something else appears to be the prenatal environment. What happens in the womb during those crucial months when the brain is forming its fundamental architecture? Testosterone exposure seems to play a role, though exactly how remains unclear. Some studies suggest higher prenatal testosterone levels correlate with increased left-handedness. Birth stress matters too. Difficult births, low birth weight, being born as part of a multiple birth, all these factors slightly increase the chances of left-handedness. But even these aren't definitive. They're just more gentle nudges, probabilistic influences stacking up during development. You can have high testosterone exposure and still be right-handed. You can have an easy birth and still favor your left hand. Biology is building handedness from dozens of inputs, genetic and environmental, none of them controlling the outcome alone. And here's something that complicates the picture even further. Handedness isn't binary. It's a spectrum. Most people aren't purely left-handed or purely right-handed. They have preferences of different strengths for different tasks. Someone might write with their left hand but throw with their right, use scissors with their right but deal cards with their left. Researchers call this mixed handedness, and it's surprisingly common, affecting maybe 30% of the population if you measure it carefully. True ambidexterity, equal skill with both hands, is incredibly rare. Maybe 1% of people, possibly less. Most people who claim to be ambidextrous are actually mixed-handed, using different hands for different tasks, not using both hands equally well for the same tasks. So what determines where you fall on this spectrum? That's what we still can't fully explain. The genes, the hormones, the birth environment, all of these matter. But there's something else, some element of developmental randomness or environmental influence we haven't identified yet. Something that kept that 10% ratio stable for 500,000 years, while the other factors varied wildly. The biology's there, we just don't understand it yet. If we don't fully understand handedness in living people, we can study directly. Imagine how hard it is to figure out which hand a Neanderthal preferred 50,000 years ago. But archaeologists have found ways. Clever indirect methods that let us read handedness in bones and stones and cave walls. Because handedness leaves traces. Subtle signatures in the archaeological record that persist long after the person who made them has turned to dust. The first clue is in the teeth. This sounds bizarre until you understand what our ancestors used their teeth for. They weren't just for eating. Teeth were tools, a third hand for holding materials while both actual hands did fine work. Someone scraping an animal hide would grip one edge in their teeth while pulling the other edge taut with their non-dominant hand and scraping with their dominant hand. Someone making cord from plant fibers would hold the material in their teeth while twisting with their hands. This leaves marks. Microscopic scratches on the front teeth, where patterns that show the angle and direction of repeated action. And here's what's remarkable. These scratches are directional. Right-handed people working with materials in their teeth create scratch patterns that angle from upper left to lower right. Left-handed people produce the opposite pattern, upper right to lower left. Study enough teeth from an ancient population, and you can estimate the percentage of left-handers. Not perfectly, the method has limitations, but well enough to detect patterns across time and species. What they found was stunning. The ratio appears in Neanderthals, Analysis of Neanderthal dental remains from multiple sites across Europe shows predominantly right-handed individuals with a consistent left-handed minority. The numbers aren't perfect, samples are small and preservation varies, but the pattern is there. Roughly 10%, maybe slightly less, showing the characteristic left-handed scratch patterns. This pushes handedness back at least 500,000 years, probably more. Neanderthals and modern humans diverge from a common ancestor somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 years ago. If both species show the same handedness ratio, that ratio was probably already established in the shared ancestral population. The pattern we see today, 90% right-handed, 10% left-handed, might be older than our species, but teeth aren't the only evidence. Stone tools tell their own story. When early humans made stone tools, they didn't just smash rocks together randomly. They used sophisticated techniques that required skill, practice, and consistent hand use. Archaeologists call it knapping, the art of striking flakes off a stone core to create sharp edges. Knapping leaves debris, lots of debris. For every finished tool, there might be hundreds of waste flakes scattered around the work site, and these flakes aren't random either. Their shape and scatter pattern depend on whether the toolmaker was holding the core in their left hand and striking with their right, or vice versa. A skilled analyst can look at an ancient knapping site and determine the handedness of the person who worked there. The oldest clear evidence goes back nearly 2 million years to Homo habilis sites in East Africa. Even these early toolmakers show a right-hand bias. Not as strong as in later species, the ratio might have been more like 70-30 instead of 90-10, but the asymmetry was already present. Our ancestors favoured their right hands for precision work before they had learned to control fire, before their brains had grown to anything approaching modern size. This matters because it ties handedness to something fundamental about how our brains evolved. The left hemisphere doesn't just control the right hand, it's also where language lives for most people. The same brain region that lets you form words is adjacent to the region that controls fine motor movement in your dominant hand. This isn't coincidence. The leading theory, still debated but increasingly supported by evidence, is that handedness emerged as a side effect of the evolution of communication. As our ancestors developed more sophisticated vocal abilities, the left hemisphere specialized for the complex motor control needed for speech. This specialization spilled over into hand control, giving most people better fine motor skills with their right hand. Handedness might be an evolutionary byproduct, not an adaptation in itself, but a consequence of our brain's solution to the problem of language. If that's true, the persistence of the left-handed minority becomes even more puzzling. You'd expect natural selection to clean up byproducts eventually, to optimize the system, but it didn't. For hundreds of thousands of years, through species splits and continental migrations and massive environmental changes, that 10% ratio held steady. Then there are the caves. Deep in limestone caverns across Europe, painted and engraved tens of thousands of years ago, our ancestors left images of stunning beauty and sophistication, animals in motion, abstract patterns, and something simpler, handprints. The technique was straightforward. Place your hand against the cave wall, fill your mouth with pigment mixed with water or fat, and blow. The pigment sprays around your hand, leaving a negative image, a stencil of your palm and fingers preserved in stone. At sites like Lascaux in France and El Castillo in Spain, these hands cluster by the dozens, sometimes hundreds, a crowd reaching across millennia to touch us. Most are left hands. At first glance, this seems to suggest everyone was left-handed, a complete reversal of the modern pattern. But think about the mechanics. To blow pigment effectively, you need your dominant hand free to steady yourself or hold the blowing tube. You place your non-dominant hand on the wall. Right-handed people would place their left hands. The predominance of left-hand prints actually confirms right-handed dominance. But not all the prints are left hands. A persistent minority, roughly 10 to 15% depending on the cave, are right-hand prints. Left-handers placing their non-dominant hands on the wall while they blew with their dominant right hands. Even in this ancient act of art-making, the ratio appears. It's everywhere you look in the deep past. Whenever archaeologists find a way to detect handedness in ancient populations, the same pattern emerges, predominantly right-handed, with a stable left-handed minority. This consistency across hundreds of thousands of years, across multiple human species, across every continent our ancestors reached, suggests the ratio isn't random, It's maintained by something. Some balance of evolutionary pressures that we're still trying to understand. Maybe the 10% isn't a flaw, maybe it's the solution. So here's the problem that should keep evolutionary biologists awake at night. If right-handedness provides clear advantages, if it makes you more compatible with the tools and weapons everyone else is designing, if it helps you coordinate better in group tasks, then natural selection should have eliminated left-handedness hundreds of thousands of years ago. Evolution is ruthlessly efficient at removing disadvantages. A trait that reduces your survival or reproductive success by even a small percentage gets weeded out over enough generations. We're not talking about dozens of generations here. We're talking about 30,000 generations of modern humans, plus hundreds of thousands of generations before that in ancestral species. That's enough time to eliminate traits that are vastly more subtle than handedness. Yet left-handers persist. Not just persist, they maintain almost exactly the same percentage across all human populations, throughout recorded history, probably throughout prehistory. This isn't random genetic drift. This is a ratio being actively maintained by evolutionary forces we're only beginning to understand. The answer might be violence. Which sounds dark, but stay with it because the evidence is surprisingly robust. It's called the fighting hypothesis, and it starts with a simple observation. If you're right-handed and you've spent your whole life fighting other right-handed people, you've learned to read and counter right-handed attacks. Your muscle memory is calibrated to defend against right-hand strikes. Then you face someone left-handed. Everything's mirrored. The angles are wrong. Your practiced defenses don't work as well. You're suddenly fighting someone whose every move feels backwards, unpredictable. You're at disadvantage. This isn't just theory. Modern combat sports data supports it. Left-handed fighters are statistically overrepresented at elite levels in boxing, fencing, and mixed martial arts. Not because being left-handed makes you intrinsically better at fighting, but because you spend your career training against right-handers while right-handers get less experience against you. You're a constant surprise. They're familiar territory. Studies have quantified this advantage. In professional boxing, left-handers make up about 10% of the general population, but roughly 20% of top-ranked fighters. In Olympic fencing, the bias is even stronger. The surprise element provides a real, measurable advantage in combat. But here's where it gets really interesting. The advantage only works if you're rare. This is what evolutionary biologists call frequency-dependent selection. The fitness of a trait depends not on the trait itself, but on how common it is in the population. Left-handedness provides an advantage specifically because most people are right-handed. If everyone were left-handed, there'd be no advantage. If the population were 50-50, the advantage would disappear. Each side would be equally familiar with the other. The math creates a natural equilibrium. As left-handers become more common, their advantage shrinks. As they become rarer, their advantage grows. There's a sweet spot where the benefit of the surprise advantage exactly balances the costs of living in a right-handed world. Mathematical models of frequency-dependent selection, when you plug in reasonable estimates for the combat advantage and the various disadvantages of being left-handed, predict an equilibrium right around 8 to 12%, which is exactly what we see. That can't be coincidence. The ratio isn't maintained despite selection. It's maintained by selection, by competing pressures that balance at roughly 10% left-handed. But there's another layer. The equilibrium shifts depending on how violent a society is. Anthropologist Charlotte Forey conducted studies comparing left-handedness rates across traditional societies with different levels of endemic violence. Societies with higher homicide rates, where fighting skill mattered more for survival and reproduction, showed slightly higher percentages of left-handers. Peaceful societies showed slightly lower percentages. The pattern held across multiple cultures on different continents. The interpretation is elegant. In peaceful, highly cooperative societies, the disadvantages of left-handedness outweigh the combat advantage. Shared tools are designed for right-handers. Coordinated work goes smoother when everyone's dominant hand is the same. Left-handers face costs without reaping many benefits. Their percentage drops slightly. In violent societies where combat skill might determine whether you live long enough to have children, the surprise advantage becomes more valuable. The equilibrium shifts upward. This is the cooperation-competition model, and it explains something that puzzled researchers for decades. Why doesn't every population show exactly the same ratio? If handedness were purely genetic, you'd expect random variation between populations but no systematic patterns. But the variation isn't random. It correlates with social violence levels. The ratio is being fine-tuned by local conditions. There's even evidence the ratio has shifted historically within populations. Some researchers argue that the percentage of left-handers has been slowly increasing in Western societies over the past century. This might reflect decreasing violence and decreasing social pressure to conform. As fighting becomes less important for survival and forced switching becomes less common, the costs of left-handedness drop and the equilibrium percentage rises slightly. But it never rises too far. Even in the most peaceful modern societies, even with virtually no pressure to switch hands, the ratio stays below 15%. The combat advantage still matters, or mattered recently enough that selection hasn't had time to eliminate it completely. We might be walking around with a trait that was optimized for a more violent world than most of us now inhabit. This raises uncomfortable questions about human nature. The fighting hypothesis suggests we maintained genetic diversity for violence effectiveness over hundreds of thousands of years, that our brains were shaped by selection pressures that valued surprise in combat, that roughly 10% of every human population carries a trait whose primary evolutionary advantage is making them harder to kill in hand-to-hand fighting. Maybe this explains why the ratio is so consistent across cultures. Every human society, no matter how peaceful or violent, traces back to ancestors for whom combat was an ever-present possibility. We all descend from populations where the fighting advantage mattered. The ratio got locked in deep in our evolutionary past, during times when violence was common enough to shape the human genome. And it's still there, written into roughly 10% of us, a permanent reminder that we evolved in a world where knowing how to fight could mean the difference between leaving descendants and disappearing from history. By the time writing appears and history starts keeping score, that evolutionary tug-of-war over handedness is already ancient. The fighting advantage is still there, humming quietly in the background. But now something new begins to layer over it. Culture. Humans start telling stories about the world, and those stories begin to cling to the body, to particular features, to particular sides. And for some reason, the left side becomes the one the stories don't like. You can see it in the language itself. In Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, the word for left is sinister, not metaphorically, literally. If you wanted to tell someone to turn left, you'd tell them to go sinister. Over time, that everyday directional word slid into our modern meaning: evil, malevolent, untrustworthy. The body part and the moral judgment fused. The same pattern shows up in other languages too. In English, we say someone has 2 left feet to mean they're clumsy. A left-handed compliment is an insult disguised as praise. In French, gauche means both left and socially awkward. In many Indo-European languages, the right side is linked to correctness, skill, or lawfulness, while the left side gets the leftovers: crookedness, weakness, misfortune. You don't build metaphors like that by accident. They accumulate slowly over centuries as people repeat them often enough that they begin to feel obvious, natural, as if the body itself were sending a message. But before we jump to the Roman Senate or medieval church councils, it's worth pausing in an older world where the symbolism was just beginning to crystallize. Take ancient Egypt. Egyptian art is famously standardized. Pharaohs stride forward in profile, one leg in front of the other, shoulders square, everything arranged to obey strict rules. For a long time, this made it hard for scholars to tell which hand was actually dominant in daily life. In murals, right hands dominate for practical reasons of composition, not necessarily biology. Yet when you look closer, the picture becomes more complicated. We find images of archers drawing bows with their left hands, spearmen holding weapons in their left, workers using tools in ways that suggest genuine left-hand preference. The scribes, those bureaucratic wizards of ink and papyrus, overwhelmingly write with their right hands in depictions, but not exclusively. A few left-handed figures slip through. Egyptian medical papyri list injuries to the right and left side of the body, but they don't single out left-handedness as an illness or curse. Some texts even use the left hand in ritual contexts without obvious stigma. The left side could be unlucky in certain funerary formulas, but it could also be protective in others. It was a world where left and right already carried symbolic weight. But the verdict on left-handed people themselves wasn't uniformly hostile. If there was prejudice, it was patchy, inconsistent. A left-handed archer who could defend a pharaoh would be valued, not shunned. In a sense, the evolutionary logic still whispered, If you help keep the kingdom alive, you belong. It's when we get to the Greeks and Romans that the symbolism sharpens into something harsher. The Greeks had noticed the left-right asymmetry in the body. Philosophers like Aristotle wrote about the heart leaning left, the liver leaning right, trying to map cosmic order onto human anatomy. They also had their omens. In some Greek traditions, birds appearing on the left could be lucky, but the system wasn't fully settled. The meaning of the left side slid around depending on the city, the deity, the ritual. Rome locked it down. Roman religion took omens very seriously. Augurs, the official diviners of the Republic, would stand facing south, watching the sky. Birds flying to one side signalled favour from the gods, birds to the other signalled trouble. The problem is that orientation plays tricks with words. For an augur facing south, the left-hand side was actually east, the direction of sunrise, sometimes associated with positive omens. But everyday Romans, thinking from their own point of view, gradually smoothed that complexity into a simpler rule in popular belief. Left felt wrong, right felt blessed. The Latin vocabulary started reflecting that bias. Dexter meant right, but also skilled, clever, favourable. Our word dexterity comes from it. Sinister meant left, but it crept step by step toward meanings like unlucky and inauspicious. Legal documents began to speak of a sinister event as misfortune. Poets used the left hand as a convenient symbol of error, deception, or bad luck. Imagine being a left-handed child in that world. Your body language was speaking a language you didn't choose, one that your culture had already decided sounded a little ominous. The symbolism didn't stop at the city walls. It seeped into religious texts and the stories people told about the divine. In the Hebrew Bible and later Christian tradition, the right hand of God becomes a powerful image. The Psalms speak of God's right hand upholding the faithful, shattering enemies, planting the righteous in safety. In the New Testament, Christ is described as seated at the right hand of the Father, the place of highest honour. The right hand isn't just a direction, it's a metaphor for power, protection, and favour. Then there's the more chilling image from the Gospel of Matthew, where at the final judgment, the shepherd separates sheep to his right and goats to his left. The blessed go to the right, the condemned go to the left. Later theologians and preachers would elaborate on this contrast, using right and left as shorthand for saved and damned. They weren't talking about handedness directly, but if you were already living in a culture where left meant sinister and right meant righteous, the association settled deeper into the bones. Meanwhile, far from the Mediterranean, other civilizations were drawing their own invisible lines through the human body. In ancient China, ideas of harmony and order shaped everything from city planning to handwriting. Calligraphy wasn't just writing, it was a moral and aesthetic discipline. The brush was usually held in the right hand. Not because left-handedness was seen as demonic, but because scribal technique, stroke order, and the physical layout of characters had been standardized around right-handed movement. A child who tried to write with the left would smudge ink, drag sleeves across wet characters, and disrupt the visual balance of the page. Teachers corrected this not as a spiritual emergency, but as a practical problem. Over time, though, practical corrections harden into social expectations. In some historical periods, left-handed writing or eating was strongly discouraged, especially in educated families. Manuals on proper conduct assumed the right hand as the correct one for polite behaviour. Japan, heavily influenced by Chinese writing and etiquette, developed similar expectations. Traditional brushwork and formal dining rituals privileged the right hand. Historical records from later centuries mention left-handed children being gently, and sometimes not so gently, trained to switch. The rationale could be aesthetic, social, or simply, this is how it's done. Left-handedness wasn't framed as evil so much as a sort of stubborn misalignment with the proper flow of things. Across the Pacific, in the high Andes, a very different story seems to have unfolded. In some pre-Columbian Andean cultures, including those linked to the later Inca Empire, the left side could carry a surprising prestige. Ethnographic reports from the colonial era describe beliefs in certain regions that left-handed individuals possess special spiritual abilities. They might be seen as closer to the world of spirits, more attuned to omens gifted in healing or divination. Archaeological interpretations are cautious here. Much of what we know comes filtered through Spanish chroniclers with their own biases, but hints recur. In some Andean cosmologies, dualities were central, upper and lower, male and female, left and right. Unlike in the Mediterranean tradition, these pairs weren't always ranked as good versus bad. They were complementary, like the two halves of a woven pattern. Under those conditions, being left-handed could mark you as different. Yes, but different in a way that sometimes implied power rather than stigma. It's a rare counter-narrative, a place where the left hand might be a sign of favour instead of a warning label. Put all of this together, and a pattern emerges. The biology that produced roughly 10% left-handers was universal. The stories layered on top of that biology were anything but. Some cultures quietly nudged left-handers into the right-handed mould for practical reasons. Others wrapped the left side in omens of misfortune. A few, like parts of the Andean world, saw something numinous there instead. The trait stayed the same, our reactions to it did not, and in the centuries that followed, those reactions would harden. What began as metaphor and mild superstition would turn into rules, punishments, and deliberate campaigns to bend the left hand into obedience. By the time Europe slides into what we call the Middle Ages, those metaphors about left and right have been marinating for centuries. They're in the language, they're in the law codes, they're in the way people talk about God. All that's missing is fuel. Christianity provides it. When the Roman Empire Christianizes, the old vocabulary doesn't vanish, it gets baptized. Those scriptural images of the right hand of God and the condemned standing on the left at judgment are repeated in sermons, copied in manuscripts, painted in church frescoes. Over generations, the symbolic left side slowly fuses with a new, more terrifying figure, the devil. You can trace it in the way preachers and theologians start to talk. The right hand becomes not just fortunate but righteous. The left hand becomes not just unlucky but morally suspect. In some medieval texts, the left hand is explicitly referred to as the manus diaboli, the devil's hand. This didn't mean that every left-handed peasant was automatically seen as possessed. Reality is usually more complicated than that. But it did mean that if your body favoured the left, you were starting the game with a penalty. Imagine being a child in a small village in the year 1200. You don't read Latin, you don't know what Sinister means, but you do know that the priest stands at the altar and raises his right hand to bless the congregation. You know that in icons and paintings, Christ sits at the right hand of the Father, and the damned are pushed off to the left. You hear stories of the devil whispering over someone's left shoulder, of evil approaching from the left side, of demons clawing at the left-hand path, and every time you reach for a spoon, or a stylus, or a tool, your left hand moves first. In that world, handedness isn't a private quirk. It's a visible sign that other people can notice and interpret. And in an age obsessed with hidden sin, visible signs matter. We see this anxiety spill over into one of the most chilling institutions of the late medieval and early modern world, the witch trials. The peak of witch hunts comes later, in the 16th and 17th centuries, but the groundwork is laid in medieval theology and folklore. The idea that humans can make pacts with Satan, receive marks on their bodies, gain unnatural powers, all of that begins to crystallize in the later Middle Ages. And when authorities go looking for evidence of such alliances, they look at the body. They search for extra nipples, strange moles, reversed birthmarks. They watch how the accused crosses herself, how she spins wool, how she holds a knife. In some regions and manuals, left-handedness appears quietly on the list of suspicious traits. A woman, or man, who favours the left might be noted as perverse, contrary, unnatural. Not proof on its own, but one more stone on the scale. Interrogators sometimes ask the accused to sign a confession. If the pen slipped naturally into the left hand, it could be commented on in the record. In a worldview where the devil inverts and reverses God's order, a body that seems to favour the wrong side fits the story a little too well. Most accused witches were condemned for a whole bundle of reasons: social tensions, economic envy, religious panic. But left-handedness could tint the way neighbours and judges saw someone, an extra layer of unease in a society already primed to see the left as dangerous. Outside the courtroom, life could be quietly punishing in smaller, constant ways. At the dinner table, etiquette texts and household manuals assumed the right hand as the hand that eats, serves, and blesses food. Sharing a communal bowl of stew or porridge, dipping bread into a common dish with your left hand, could be seen as dirty or even insulting. In some places it was outright forbidden as bad manners. So left-handed children were corrected again and again to favour the right hand when eating. The same happened in the monastery and the schoolroom. Medieval scriptoria, the rooms where monks copied manuscripts, were production lines of holy text. Writing was done from left to right with quill and ink. A left-handed scribe would smear the drying letters, drag his sleeve through the wet lines and disrupt the careful flow of work. The response wasn't an abstract debate about neurodiversity. The response was simple. Don't use that hand. Teachers tied left hands behind backs. They wrapped knuckles with rods. They praised proper right-handed form as orderly and godly, and scolded left-hand use as clumsy at best, willful at worst. The message seeped in. The body must obey not just God, but the social script about which side of the body belonged to him. Even architecture joined in. Castles and fortified towers in medieval Europe often have spiral staircases that twist in a particular direction. As you go up, they spiral clockwise. That's not an aesthetic quirk. It's a defense strategy. A right-handed defender descending the stairs can swing his sword freely, his right arm in the wide part of the stairwell. A right-handed attacker climbing up is cramped against the central column, his sword arm blocked, his movement hemmed in. For a right-handed defender, this is ideal. For a left-handed attacker, the spiral is flipped. Your dominant arm suddenly has the space. Your angle of attack is better. The very stone of the staircase gives you an advantage. There's an irony here. On the battlefield and in the tournament yard, the same trait that was marked as devilish in church could be terrifyingly effective in combat. European fighting styles, from knightly swordsmanship to peasant spear drills, were built on the assumption that most opponents were right-handed. Shields were carried on the left arm, swords on the right. Training manuscripts, the surviving fencing manuals of masters like Fiore de Liberi or Johannes Lichtenauer, overwhelmingly picture right-handed fighters. Tactics and footwork are designed with that pattern in mind. Enter a left-handed opponent, and the geometry of the fight shifts. Your sword comes from an unexpected angle. Your stance mirrors your opponent's in a way their muscle memory isn't ready for. Parries that work against right-handed attacks suddenly open them up to a cut from the other side. Even well-trained knights found left-handed duelists disorienting. They had to unlearn reflexes on the fly in armour, with blades moving at lethal speeds. Some contemporary accounts hint at this. Chronicles describe certain fighters as awkward or contrary in their style, unusually difficult to read. Later historians and martial arts scholars suspect many of these men were left-handed, exploiting their rarity as a weapon. In tournaments, where nobles tested their skill under controlled conditions, a left-handed jouster or swordsman could gain a psychological edge. Opponents dreaded drawing them, complained they were tricksy or unfair, whispered that their strange movements came from unholy sources. Yet the same nobles who grumbled about their methods might happily hire them in war, where victory mattered more than convention. It's possible, though hard to prove, that some of the most feared mercenaries, champions and bodyguards of the Middle Ages were left-handed. Their advantage was unspoken, half acknowledged, wrapped in the same suspicion that stalked them in church pews and village squares. Above it all, the Church's teaching cast a long shadow. Officially, theology did not declare left-handedness is a sin. Most serious theologians were more interested in the soul than in which hand held a spoon. But the sermons preached to ordinary people often weren't so precise. Homilies used the left side as a convenient stand-in for moral failure, for deviation from the straight path. Popular devotional literature repeated and amplified these images, until the line between metaphor and body began to blur. So you grew up hearing that the narrow path to salvation is on the right, that the broad road of perdition veers left, that the saved stand at God's right, the damned are pushed to his left, that to be right is to be aligned with heaven, and to be left is to slip somehow toward hell. Then you looked down and saw which hand moved first. Over time, cracks began to appear in this solid wall of assumption. As Europe edged toward the Renaissance, some scholars and physicians started to look at the body with slightly different eyes. Anatomy was studied more empirically. Human variation, differences in face, stature, proportion, began to be catalogued without always being moralized. A few writers noted that left-handedness seemed to run in families, that it appeared in noble lineages as well as among peasants, in pious monks as well as in worldly soldiers. The old superstitions didn't disappear overnight. They clung on stubbornly, especially in rural areas and in everyday habits. Parents still nudged the spoon into the right hand. Masters still insisted on right-handed penmanship. Preachers still talked about the left hand of sin. But slowly another idea crept in alongside them. Perhaps this was not a choice, or a rebellion. Perhaps some people's bodies were simply built this way. That shift in perspective would be glacial, full of backsliding and resistance. Yet it marked the beginning of a new chapter. As Europe moved into the age of exploration, printing, and scientific curiosity, the campaign against left-handedness would not vanish. It would instead become more systematic. By the time we step into the early modern and modern worlds, the story doesn't soften, it sharpens. Those vague medieval suspicions about the left side harden into something colder, more organized, and, crucially, more confident in its own righteousness. The age that prided itself on reason and progress decided that the wrong hand was a problem to be fixed, not with charms or exorcisms, with discipline, and later with science. You can watch this shift unfold in the writings of 18th and 19th century doctors, teachers, and moralists. They stop talking about devils and demons and start talking about defects, perversions, and abnormal development. The language changes, but the judgment hardly does. Left-handedness is no longer ominous because it might signal a pact with Satan. It is ominous because it might signal that your brain, your character, even your moral sense are somehow malformed. In this new framing, the body isn't cursed, it's incorrect. And incorrect things, in a rational age, are to be corrected. Schools become the front line. Imagine a classroom in Victorian England around 1880. Rows of wooden desks, inkwells set carefully into the right side of the writing surface, copybooks ruled with lines that slope to encourage a particular pen angle. Everything quietly assumes a right-handed child. You're 6. When you're asked to write your name, your left hand rises naturally. The teacher notices. Perhaps she's read the latest pamphlet from an educational reformer, insisting that left-handed writing is a habit of idleness, or a precursor to moral weakness. Perhaps she simply thinks it looks messy, that it will smear the ink, that it breaks the symmetry of the room. Either way, she walks down the row, gently takes the pen from your left hand, and places it in your right. The first correction is often soft. But if your muscles and brain have other plans, if tomorrow your left hand reaches again, things escalate. In many schools on several continents, that escalation will define your childhood. The tools of enforcement are astonishingly similar across cultures. In Britain and much of Europe, teachers tie the left hand to the chair or behind the back with straps or cord. In Tsarist Russia, accounts describe children forced to sit on their left hand while writing, their weight pinning it uselessly beneath them. In American public schools in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the bad hand is smacked with wooden rulers, metal-tipped pointers, or leather straps, knuckles reddening until the association between movement and pain is burned in. In parts of Japan, especially before and during the early 20th century, left-handedness is seen as deeply improper, even shameful. Parents worry it will mark their child as uncultured or poorly raised. Some bind the left arm at the elbow during meals or practice sessions. Some send their children to specialists who advertise methods to train the crooked hand into straightness. A child who uses chopsticks in the left hand may be corrected loudly in front of guests, the embarrassment itself another tool of conditioning. Elsewhere, ingenuity turns dark. Inventors patent devices meant to cure left-handedness, rigid metal or leather cuffs that immobilize the wrist, gloves with stiffened fingers, straps that connect the left hand to the belt so it cannot reach the desk. One 19th century American catalogue proudly offers a schoolroom aid that locks the left forearm to the chair's underside, leaving the right arm free to operate normally. The message is relentless and simple. The left hand is not to be trusted. It must be restrained until it learns obedience, or until the child learns to pretend. Public shaming does the rest. Teachers hold up the stubborn left-hander as a bad example. Classmates snicker when a child fumbles trying to write with the untrained hand, lines shaky and uneven. Report cards carry notes. User's left hand must be corrected. Parents repeat the pressure at home, worried their child will be disadvantaged or worse, branded as defective. For many children, this daily friction becomes invisible, just part of the background of growing up. For others, it leaves scars that are harder to see. When psychologists in the 20th century finally begin to study the long-term effects of forced switching, they find patterns that are uncomfortable to dismiss as coincidence. people who were systematically compelled to abandon their natural left-handedness show, on average, higher rates of stuttering. Speech emerges from complex timing between brain regions and muscles of the mouth and tongue. Scrambling the usual patterns of motor control, forcing the brain to reroute fine movement through unfamiliar circuits, seems in many cases to ripple outward into speech. Reading difficulties appear more often too. Some forced-switched individuals report letter reversals, trouble tracking lines across a page, or an almost painful sense that the act of reading never quite becomes automatic. For a minority, this seems to blend into what we would now call dyslexia, though the boundaries are fuzzy and still debated. There are emotional costs as well. Studies and memoirs from the mid-20th century describe people who grew up under strict right-hand enforcement as more likely to report anxiety, chronic self-consciousness, or a lingering sense that something about their body was fundamentally wrong. Spatial reasoning tasks, like mentally rotating objects or navigating unfamiliar spaces, sometimes show subtle differences in adults who were switched, hinting that the brain's internal maps were forced to compromise. None of this is absolute. Many forced-switched children adapt without obvious problems. Human brains are resilient. But on the population level, the trend is clear enough to make later researchers uneasy. The campaign to normalize handedness may have been injuring the very minds it claimed to improve. Even at the highest levels of society, you can see the imprint. Consider Prince Albert, later King George VI of Britain, the reluctant monarch whose struggle with stuttering was made famous in The King's Speech. As a child, Bertie was naturally left-handed. Court etiquette, however, demanded right-handedness. He was pressured, like countless less privileged children, to write and perform tasks with his right hand. Some historians and speech specialists suspect that this forced conversion aggravated an existing vulnerability in his speech, contributing to the painful stammer that haunted his public life. He was not alone. Diaries, letters, and biographies from the 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally mention correcting a child's sinister tendencies, often in the same breath as noting later speech problems or nervous dispositions. The connection was rarely made at the time. It would take decades before clinicians began to wonder whether those early battles over the pen and the spoon had unintended consequences. Yet the machinery that kept this campaign going did not see itself as cruel. It saw itself as scientific. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, new fields like criminology and experimental psychology emerge. Some of their pioneers are careful and nuanced. Others, particularly those dabbling in phrenology and early degeneration theories, are eager to find physical markers of moral and mental failure. Left-handedness, already burdened with centuries of suspicion, is an easy target. Certain doctors classify it as a neurotic sign, lumped together with nervous tics and seizures. Some educators publish manuals warning that left-handed children are more prone to waywardness, truancy, or even criminality. One influential criminologist, Cesare Lombroso, famously tried to identify born criminals through bodily stigmata. In some of his followers' lists, left-handedness appears as another item on the checklist of potential deviants. Newspapers pick up these claims, distill them, and spread them. A sensational article might announce that criminals are often left-handed, without noting that the correlation is weak, confounded, or entirely anecdotal. Parents read the headline, look at the fork in their child's left hand, and feel a spike of fear. Fear is a powerful motivator. It keeps the practice alive long after the theology that first stigmatized the left side has faded. So the 20th century arrives, gleaming with modern technology, and in classrooms across Europe, North America, and Asia, the same old scene plays out. A child reaches with the hand that feels natural, and an adult moves it, scolds it, or straps it down. If you talk to older relatives, you may still hear their stories. People who went to school in the 1950s and 1960s in Britain or the United States recall teachers slapping their left hand with a ruler whenever it crept toward the pencil. In Ireland, some remember being called awkward or contrary in front of the whole class. In parts of Japan, Korea, India, and the Middle East, children in the 1970s and 1980s are still being corrected at home and at school. The left hand is for unclean tasks, for the toilet, for things you hide. The right is for writing, eating, greeting. To mix them up is to invite disgust or ridicule. Official policies begin to soften in many Western countries around the 1960s and 70s. New research on brain lateralization suggests that left-handedness is a natural variation, not a defect. Educational guidelines cautiously advise teachers to let children choose their dominant hand. Hollywood stars and public figures openly identify as left-handed, chipping away at the sense of stigma. But practices often lag behind policies. In rural areas, in conservative school systems, in families shaped by older beliefs, the old corrections continue. Even into the 1980s and 1990s, researchers document teachers in parts of Eastern Europe, Latin America and Asia tying or taping children's left hands, insisting that no good will come from letting them write that way. And in some places, it still happens today. Quietly, behind closed classroom doors or at family dinner tables, a new generation of children is told that their natural inclination is wrong, that their body must be straightened, that conformity is safer than comfort. The tools may be softer now, gentle but relentless redirection, a constant chorus of use the other hand. But the underlying idea has barely changed since the days of the medieval scribe. The idea that there is one correct way to be human and that all other ways must be bent until they fit. Yet despite centuries of effort, the statistics refuse to obey. Roughly 1 in 10 people still grows up left-handed, even after generations of pressure. The campaign to erase them has not only failed, it has inadvertently revealed something about the stubbornness of human variation, and about what happens in the brain when we try to overwrite it by force. If the last few centuries were obsessed with straightening the left hand, the last few decades have been obsessed with explaining it. Once brain scanners arrived and neuroscience began to leave its infancy, a new story took shape. It sounded modern, scientific, almost flattering. Left-handers weren't cursed, they were creative. You've probably heard some version of this. Left-handed people are right-brained, and the right hemisphere is where art, music, imagination and emotion live. Therefore, the story goes, left-handers are naturally more creative, more intuitive, maybe even a bit more brilliant and eccentric. It's a comforting reversal, from deviant to gifted, from sinister to special. But like most simple stories about the brain, it's mostly wrong. The whole left brain/right brain myth began in the mid-20th century, when researchers studied patients whose cerebral hemispheres had been surgically separated to treat severe epilepsy. These split brain experiments showed that the left hemisphere tends to handle language and analytic processing, while the right is often stronger in spatial and some emotional tasks. The media took this grain of truth and baked it into a loaf of pop psychology. Logical left brain, creative right brain. Engineers use the left hemisphere, artists use the right. Left-handers must be right brain dominant, so they're all little Picassos. It was tidy. It sold books. It showed up in magazine quizzes and business seminars and school workshops. And it glossed over how messy real brains are. Neuroscience today paints a very different picture. Yes, certain functions tend to be more common in one hemisphere than the other, but your brain is not a house divided into neatly labelled rooms. It's a densely interconnected city, with traffic constantly flowing across a bridge called the corpus callosum. Creativity, for instance, doesn't live in the right hemisphere. It recruits networks in both sides: visual, emotional, motor, memory, language, and control systems all talking at once. So where do left-handers fit into this? The surprising answer is that they are in some ways less divided. If you put right-handed and left-handed people into an fMRI scanner and ask them to do language tasks, motor tasks, or math problems, a pattern appears. Most right-handers show strong lateralization. Language heavily favours the left hemisphere. Certain spatial tasks favour the right. Motor control maps cleanly. Left-handers are more complicated. As a group, they tend to have brains that are less strictly lateralized. Many still process language primarily in the left hemisphere, but not to the same overwhelming degree. Some show bilateral language, both hemispheres participating more equally. A smaller but notable minority shift language to the right hemisphere altogether. This isn't a defect. It's just a different wiring scheme. Think of the standard right-handed brain as a company where departments are very specialized and mostly live on one floor of the building. The left-handed brain, on average, spreads some of those departments across floors and lets more doors stay open between offices. That more symmetrical distribution of work might come with a subtle advantage: flexibility. When tasks require integrating different kinds of information, words and images, logic and intuition, rule following and improvisation, Having functions more shared between hemispheres could, in some situations, make it easier to recruit extra neural resources. If one side takes a hit through injury or stroke, left-handers also seem slightly more likely to rebound by shifting functions to the other side. This is part of why surgeons and neurologists are so cautious with left-handed patients. The usual maps, this bit is for speech, that bit for movement, are less reliable. Before operating near language areas, they often run extra tests, stimulating specific brain regions while patients speak or read to see where functions actually live in that particular person. The variability isn't random, though. Statistically, about 95% of right-handers process language primarily in the left hemisphere. It's one of the most robust facts in brain science. Among left-handers, that number drops. Depending on the study, somewhere between 60 and 80% still use the left side for language, 10 to 20% use the right, and the rest show genuine bilateral sharing. In other words, being left-handed doesn't mean your language moves to the right side. It means you're more likely than a right-hander to break the usual rule. This same theme, greater variability, looser divisions, shows up in other domains too. Researchers have tested left and right-handers on all kinds of abilities. Divergent thinking, how many uses can you imagine for a brick? Musical improvisation, three-dimensional mental rotation, even certain types of mathematical reasoning. Some studies find small but noticeable advantages in left-handers on tasks that reward thinking outside conventional patterns or juggling multiple ideas at once. In parts of the mathematical and musical elite, left-handers also appear slightly overrepresented. When scientists look at samples of highly accomplished musicians, architects, or theoretical physicists, they sometimes find more left-handers than you'd expect from the general population. But there are important caveats. These effects are usually modest, and not every study agrees. Some find no difference at all. Others suggest that any advantage only shows up in particular subgroups, like men in highly competitive math fields, or people who are strongly left-handed rather than mixed. And there's always the question of how much is cause and how much is culture. A child who learns early that they are different may grow up more willing to zig when others zag, to occupy niches others ignore. There is no evidence that being left-handed automatically makes you a genius, an artist, or a visionary. Most left-handers are perfectly ordinary. So are most right-handers. The distributions of talent overlap almost completely. The brain story has a darker side too. Large epidemiological studies have noticed that left-handedness is very slightly more common in some conditions. Dyslexia, ADHD, certain learning difficulties, and, in some reports, autoimmune disorders like type 1 diabetes or rheumatoid arthritis. Not by a huge margin, often just a few extra cases per 100, but enough to raise questions. In the 1980s, neurologist Norman Geschwind and biologist Albert Galaberda proposed an intriguing and controversial explanation. They suggested that higher levels of prenatal testosterone might slow the development of the left hemisphere in some fetuses. If the left side is delayed, the right side might assume more control over functions like language or fine motor skills, nudging the child toward left-handedness or mixed-handedness. At the same time, those same hormonal patterns could alter immune system development, increasing susceptibility to certain disorders. In this view, left-handedness isn't a cause of dyslexia or autoimmune disease. It's another outcome of an underlying developmental pathway that sometimes comes with costs and sometimes with benefits. Unusual talents, different cognitive styles, vulnerabilities in certain systems. The Geschwind-Galaberda hypothesis is elegant, and parts of it remain influential, but the data are messy. Later studies have struggled to pin down consistent hormonal effects. Some of the early correlations weaken or vanish when you control for confounding factors like birth complications, prematurity, or social bias against admitting left-handedness in older generations. The safest thing we can say is this: left-handedness often coexists with other unusual patterns in brain and body development. Sometimes that clustering looks like advantage. Sometimes it looks like risk. Often it looks like neither, just difference. This is where our stories tend to swing between extremes. For centuries, left-handers were branded as suspicious, defective, dangerous. In reaction, 20th century popular culture sometimes flipped the script too far the other way, romanticizing them as natural geniuses, tortured artists, or secret rebels against conformity. Both impulses, condemnation and celebration, can miss the point. When we pathologize left-handedness, we turn a common minority trait into a mark of doom, ignoring the millions of left-handers living ordinary healthy lives. When we glorify it as a golden ticket to creativity, we load people with expectations they never asked for, and erase the struggles of those who don't match the myth. The reality is more interesting and gentler. Left-handedness seems to be one expression of a broader variability in how human brains wire themselves up, how they divide labor between hemispheres, how they balance specialization with redundancy, how they trade rigidity for flexibility. That variability likely helped our ancestors adapt to changing environments and complex social worlds. A population where everyone thinks exactly the same way is brittle. A population with many ways of mapping the world onto the brain is resilient. So when you see a left-hander writing, playing guitar upside down, or navigating a world designed for someone else's body, you're seeing the surface of something deep and ancient, the quiet diversity built into our species. Not a curse, not a superpower, just one of the many ways a human brain can be. And yet, for such a familiar trait, even now in the age of fMRI machines and genetic sequencing, we're still circling the same question. What exactly makes someone left-handed in the first place? If left-handedness is just one way to wire a human brain, it's natural to wonder about the people whose brains and hands left fingerprints all over history. Some of them we know were left-handed, as far as records allow us to know anything about small habits of long-dead people. Others live in a fuzzy space of rumor, artistic convention, and wishful thinking. Let's start with the one man every left-handed kid hears about at some point, often delivered with a mix of awe and relief, Leonardo da Vinci. If there's such a thing as a patron saint of left-handers, it's him. Leonardo is one of the rare historical figures whose left-handedness is not just a curiosity, it's actually visible in his work. His notebooks are full of what's known as mirror writing. He wrote from right to left with letters reversed, so you'd need a mirror to read them easily. People have sometimes imagined this as a code to hide his ideas from prying eyes. That's romantic, but probably backwards. For a left-hander writing with ink on rough paper, moving from right to left simply means your hand follows behind the fresh writing instead of smearing across it. What looks like a secret cipher may just be a very practical solution to a very mundane problem: wet ink and a dominant left hand. Art historians have also noticed that his drawing technique, especially in his earlier works, reflects a left-handed motion. The direction of his hatching lines, the way he shades curves, the subtle habits of a hand that prefers to pull the pen or brush in certain arcs, it all lines up with a left-hander at work. Did that actually shape the way he saw the world? It's hard to say, but Leonardo was obsessed with observation. Turbulence in water, spirals in hair, the branching of trees, the geometry hidden inside muscles and bones. A brain that distributed tasks a little differently. A hand that naturally approached lines and contours from the opposite angle of most of his peers. These might have nudged him toward noticing what others overlooked. Still, it's safer not to turn his left hand into a magic talisman. Leonardo wasn't extraordinary because he was left-handed. He was extraordinary, and he happened to be left-handed. If Leonardo represents the left-hander as visionary, other stories frame the left-hander as something more dangerous, the unexpected warrior. One of the oldest literary references to a left-handed hero comes from the Hebrew Bible, in the Book of Judges. Ehud, son of Gera, is described as restricted in his right hand, which many scholars interpret as left-handedness. In the story, this unusual trait becomes a weapon. Ehud straps a short sword to his right thigh, opposite of where a right-handed man's weapon would be expected. When he appears before the Moabite king Eglon, the guards don't search that side carefully. Ehud reaches across his body with his left hand, draws the hidden sword and assassinates the king. It's a vivid, almost cinematic scene, and it captures a recurring theme in the cultural history of left-handedness. In a world that plans for the majority, the minority sometimes gains an edge precisely because they are unexpected. Fast forward more than 1,000 years, and that idea reappears in how we've talked about some of history's most famous generals. Alexander the Great is often claimed as left-handed. You'll see this repeated in books, on websites, in trivia quizzes. The evidence is thin. Some ancient sources make vague comments about his posture or the way he held his spear. Later legends embroidered details. Modern illustrators, eager to make him stand out, sometimes show him wielding weapons in his left hand. It's possible he really was left-handed. It's equally possible we're looking at centuries of people reading their own fascinations back into the past. Napoleon Bonaparte is another favourite famous lefty, whose case evaporates when you get close to it. The image of Napoleon writing or gesturing with his left hand mostly comes from portraits, but those portraits followed conventions, not anatomical surveys. Artists often arranged their sitters in mirror image poses or flipped compositions for aesthetic balance. Some paintings even got reversed during the printmaking process, accidentally turning right into left. Contemporary reports don't clearly mark Napoleon as left-handed, and the cultures around him were usually quick to notice and comment on such things. His supposed left-handedness is likely a trick of art history and repetition, a rumour that hardened into fact because it felt interesting. These contested cases are a good reminder that before the 20th century, no one was collecting systematic data on which hand you used for everyday tasks. Handedness was common knowledge among your family and neighbours. It was rarely written down. That makes it all the more striking when we reach a period where records are better, and we see a cluster that is very real. Modern American presidents. If you look at the list of US presidents from the mid-20th century onward, something odd jumps out. For much of history, left-handers at the very top of politics are rare or unknown. Then, suddenly, they start appearing at rates far above the 10% you'd expect in the general population. Harry Truman was left-handed, though like many of his generation he was trained to write with his right hand. James Garfield is sometimes counted as left-handed or ambidextrous. He could reputedly write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other at the same time, which, if not exaggerated, suggests a very unusual motor control pattern. In the late 20th century the pattern becomes clearer. Gerald Ford was left-handed, so was George H.W. Bush, so was Bill Clinton, so is Barack Obama. For a while, 3 consecutive presidents, Bush, Clinton and Obama, were all left-handers. In the 1992 election, all 3 major candidates, Bush, Clinton and Ross Perot, were left-handed. Statistically, that's highly unlikely to be random. Does this mean left-handers are somehow better suited to high office? We don't know. It could be a real signal. Perhaps traits that correlate loosely with left-handedness. Comfort with standing out, different communication styles, certain cognitive patterns, offer small advantages in modern politics. It could just as easily be a coincidence amplified by media fascination. Once journalists started talking about the left-handed President's Club, the pattern became a story in its own right. Whatever the reason, for left-handed children watching those inaugurations, it quietly rewrote an older script. The hand that teachers once tied behind your back was now the hand on the Bible, or on the oath of office. Beyond politics and painting, left-handers have also left a distinct mark on sound. In the world of music, especially guitars, handedness is not just a detail. It physically changes how the instrument is played. Jimi Hendrix is the most famous example. He was naturally left-handed, but instead of using a special left-handed guitar, he often took a standard right-handed instrument, flipped it upside down and restrung it. That put the thick low strings on the bottom edge, the thin high strings on top, reversing the way the guitar's body and electronics were designed to interact with the strings. This small mechanical change altered the tension, the way bends felt under his fingers, the relationship between his picking hand and the pickup magnets. Some musicians and historians argue that this contributed to his distinctive tone and phrasing. The fluid, vocal-like bends, the way chords and feedback bloomed from his hands. Paul McCartney took a different route. Also left-handed, he plays a lefty bass, mirror-imaged from the standard. But his position within the Beatles, singing, writing and anchoring the rhythm section from the other side of the stage, visually and musically shifted the band's symmetry. Kurt Cobain, another iconic left-handed guitarist, likewise favoured left-handed instruments, sometimes modified, sometimes roughly handled. His scrappy, jagged playing style, the way he attacked chords and used dissonance, is hard to separate from the physicality of a left-hander, insisting on his own orientation in a right-handed world of gear. In each case, left-handedness isn't just trivia. It subtly shapes technique, ergonomics, and sound. Science and mathematics have their rumoured left-handers too. Marie Curie is often listed as left-handed, though firm documentation is scarce. Most of what we know comes from later accounts and a few photographs that are ambiguous at best. Alan Turing, the father of modern computing, shows up on similar lists, but again, first-hand descriptions of his daily handedness are thin. Nikola Tesla is another perennial candidate. He wrote about his unusual sensory experiences and habits of mind, and later admirers folded left-handedness into that portrait, sometimes without clear sources. The problem runs deeper than just missing data. In older photographs, people sometimes posed with their non-dominant hand forward for compositional reasons. In paintings, artists flipped scenes. In cultures where left-hand use was stigmatized, individuals might suppress their natural preferences in public, especially for writing, even if they used their left hand for other tasks in private. So when you see long lists online of famous left-handers, many of those names are best treated as maybes, not certainties. This brings us to an important caution. Once you start paying attention to left-handedness, it's very easy to slip into confirmation bias. You notice that Leonardo was left-handed, that Hendrix was left-handed, that several presidents and maybe a few scientific geniuses were left-handed. You build a mental story where left-handers are everywhere, at the heights of achievement. You forget all the quietly left-handed people who never become famous, and you forget that the vast majority of history's towering figures, Einstein, Newton, Mozart, Churchill, Shakespeare, most of the philosophers, most of the rulers, most of the revolutionaries were probably right-handed, simply because most humans are. Right-handers don't end up on special lists because their handedness is invisible, taken for granted, like having brown eyes or average height. If 10% of people are left-handed, and 10% of Nobel laureates are left-handed, and 10% of criminals are left-handed, and 10% of farmers and nurses and quiet neighbours are left-handed, that's exactly what you'd expect. We remember the striking cases. We build patterns out of them. Sometimes the patterns are real, sometimes they're just reflections of the stories we prefer to tell. Still, there is something undeniably comforting about tracing this thread through the past, knowing that across centuries of suspicion and forced correction, left-handed people have always been there, painting, composing, ruling, revolting, writing with mirrored letters in cramped notebooks. The world may be built for the right hand, but the left hand has never stayed entirely in its shadow. And that raises another question, one that pulls us out of biography and back into the structures around us. What does it actually mean to live in a right-handed world when your body and your brain lean left? Step into your own day for a moment. You wake up, reach for the lamp on your bedside table, and if you're left-handed, there's a good chance the switch is on the wrong side. You move into the kitchen. The can opener is shaped so that using it with your left hand feels clumsy, backward. The handle of the coffee mug faces right in the cupboard. The measuring cups are printed so that the numbers face you if you hold them in your right hand. None of this is dramatic. That's part of the point. We built the modern world as if right-handedness were not just common, but universal. 10% of people move through an environment that quietly assumes they don't exist. Look at ordinary tools. Standard scissors are molded so the blades press together only when you squeeze with your right hand. Try them with your left, and the blades tend to splay apart, crushing paper instead of cutting it cleanly. Spiral notebooks put the metal coil exactly where a left-hander's wrist wants to rest, digging into the skin, forcing the hand up into an awkward claw. At school, one-armed desks, those little chair and desk combos, nearly always put the writing surface on the right. Left-handed kids learn to twist sideways, leaning over an invisible desk that was never there. Sit at a public computer and the mouse is likely on the right side with the buttons mapped for a right-handed index finger. Credit card machines and signature pads on counters are bolted down on the cashier's right. Pens on chains are clipped to the right. Even door handles, oven knobs, and gear shifts tend to assume a right-handed grip. Each of these is a minor inconvenience. Add them together over years and you have something else. An invisible curriculum in how to contort yourself to fit a world that did not plan for you. Most of the time, this is just uncomfortable. Sometimes it's dangerous, because the same design assumptions that shape scissors and desks also shape saws, presses, and guns. Power tools, from circular saws to angle grinders, are often built so that safety guards, emergency stops, and exhaust vents are optimally placed for right-handed operation. Use them with your left, and suddenly the guard blocks your view. The dust blows into your face. The kill switch is further from your dominant hand. Industrial controls, levers, and foot pedals are arranged so a worker standing in a standard posture, right hand forward, can react quickly. A left-handed worker has to cross arms, shift stance, or reach a little further in a crisis. In high-risk occupations, those extra fractions of a second can matter. Firearms are another example. Most are designed for right-handed shooters. The ejection port, that little opening where spent cartridges fly out, is on the right. A right-handed person lifts the rifle to their right shoulder, and hot brass pops safely away. A left-hander tries the same thing and finds cartridges spitting across their field of view, sometimes even against their face or arm. The safety, magazine release, and bolt handle are usually positioned for a right thumb or right index finger. A left-handed soldier or police officer must either adapt or search for specialized equipment. For much of the 20th century, left-handers in these environments were simply expected to switch hands or get used to it. Accident statistics in some studies hinted that left-handers in certain manual trades and driving-related jobs had higher injury and mortality rates. The pattern was murky, confounded by many other factors, but it raised uncomfortable questions about what happens when a minority body moves through a world tuned for a majority. In 1991, those questions exploded into public view with a single striking claim: left-handers die younger. Two researchers, Diane Halpern and Stanley Coren, published a paper suggesting that left-handed people, on average, died several years earlier than right-handers. Newspapers seized on the result. Magazine covers talked about the deadly risk of being left-handed. For a while, it sounded as if the simple fact of using your left hand came with a built-in expiration date. The idea fit too neatly with a century of anecdotes, stories of awkward tools, dangerous machinery, and a lifetime of small disadvantages. Maybe, people thought, all those little design biases added up in the harshest way possible. But as other scientists looked closely at the study, cracks appeared. Halpern and Coren had used a particular kind of sample, obituaries and questionnaires that asked relatives whether the deceased had been left or right-handed. That introduced several biases at once. Older generations, born when left-handedness was heavily suppressed, were more likely to have been forcibly retrained to write with their right hand. Some would identify as right-handed in records even if they had been naturally left-handed as children. So in a pool of people who had already died, the older deaths skewed toward right-handed, simply because those birth cohorts had fewer openly left-handed individuals. The more recent deaths, people who grew up after some of the stigma had eased, showed a higher proportion of self-identified left-handers. It created an illusion. Left-handers seemed to die younger, when in reality the categories themselves were shifting across time. When later studies used better methods, tracking living populations forward, controlling for age, health, and other variables, they did not find a clear dramatic gap in life expectancy between left and right-handers. Today, most researchers view the lefties die younger claim as a methodological artifact, a mirage produced by changing social attitudes and flawed sampling. Still, the episode revealed something revealing about our world. It was easy to believe left-handers might be at extra risk because you can see the risks built into everyday design. Even something as simple as writing is shaped by this invisible bias. If you're right-handed and you write in English, your hand moves from left to right, pulling across the page, staying mostly behind the fresh ink or graphite. If you're left-handed, you're often forced into one of two awkward postures. Either you hook your hand over the top of the line, bending your wrist into a tight curve so your fingers come down from above the text, or you write underneath, twisting your arm so that your hand pushes across wet ink, smudging as you go. Many left-handers remember as children the grey smear on the side of their hand after a day of writing. Not a catastrophe, just another small reminder that the system was not built with them in mind. In right-to-left scripts, like Arabic and Hebrew, the situation can flip. A left-handed writer moving from right to left is now pulling the pen rather than pushing it, more like a right-handed English writer. Their hand trails behind the writing, not ahead of it. Ink smudging is less of a problem. For once, the flow of the letters and the natural movement of the left hand line up more gracefully. This doesn't turn Arabic into a secret haven of left-handedness. Stigma and cultural preferences can still exist. But it shows how even the direction of a writing system can either fight or cooperate with a particular body. Yet in some corners of life, being left-handed doesn't just mean struggle, it can offer an edge. Nowhere is that clearer than in certain sports. In interactive, opponent-based games, baseball, tennis, fencing, boxing, cricket, left-handers are consistently overrepresented at the top levels compared to their share of the general population. Why? One leading idea is about frequency and surprise. Most players spend most of their training and competition facing right-handers. They learn the typical angles, the way a right-handed pitcher's ball curves, the standard direction of a serve, the dominant guard in fencing, the usual stance of a boxer. When they finally meet a left-hander, everything is mirrored. The spin reverses. The attack lines come from unexpected directions. Footwork patterns and muscle memory, honed against right-handed opponents, suddenly misfire. Left-handers, on the other hand, grow up in a right-handed majority. They face right-handers constantly. Their brains and bodies get used to both mirror images, their own movement patterns and their opponents. In effect, they become bilingual in handedness, while right-handers remain mostly monolingual. In baseball, left-handed pitchers and batters can exploit angles that are inherently awkward for right-handers. In fencing, a left-handed opponent presents lines of attack that many competitors see only rarely in practice. In boxing, a southpaw stance forces right-handed fighters to adjust their guard, their timing, even their preferred combinations. It's not that left-handed people are magically better athletes. It's that a minority trait, in a competitive, interactive environment, can become a strategic advantage precisely because it is rare. So on one side of the ledger, we have scissors that don't cut and desks that don't fit. On the other, a curveball that seems to defy expectation. Somewhere between these trivial annoyances and narrow advantages, the world has slowly, cautiously, begun to bend. In recent decades, a small ecosystem of left-handed accommodation has emerged. You can now walk into specialty shops, physical or online, and find scissors molded for the left hand, where the blades align properly when squeezed. You can buy left-handed can openers, measuring tapes that read correctly when held in the left hand, computer mice sculpted for a left grip. Guitars are built in mirror image, with all the controls and cutaways reversed. Some manufacturers offer ambidextrous game controllers and ergonomic tools. Schools, too, have changed. It's increasingly rare in many countries for teachers to force a naturally left-handed child to switch. Some classrooms provide left-handed scissors and even left-handed desks. Writing instruction sometimes includes guidance on hand position and paper angle for left-handers to reduce strain and smudging. These are small steps, but they mark a shift in attitude. From you must adapt to the world toward perhaps the world can adapt a little to you. The right-handed bias hasn't vanished. Most ATMs still put the card slot and keypad on the right. Most turnstiles ask for your dominant right hand. Most tools on a construction site will still assume a right-handed worker is in charge. But for the first time in history, the existence of left-handers is not just tolerated, or punished, or mythologized. It's being quietly, practically acknowledged in plastic and wood and metal. Underneath all of this, the awkward scissors, the dangerous tools, the unexpected sports victories, lies a deeper question. What, exactly, is going on in the left-handed brain that makes this minority both so persistent and so intriguingly different? To answer that, we have to leave the world of desks and doorknobs and step into the tangle of neurons and hemispheres inside the skull. The first thing modern science discovered about handedness is how little it understands it. For most of the 20th century, researchers assumed there would be a simple answer hiding somewhere in the body. A left-handed gene, a switch in the motor cortex, a single quirk in early development that nudged the right hand or the left into dominance and stayed that way for life. Instead, as the tools got sharper, the picture got stranger. In 2019, a team at Oxford looked not at dozens or hundreds, but at hundreds of thousands of people. They used data from the UK Biobank, a massive project that pairs DNA with brain scans and health records. If there was a neat single gene for left-handedness, this is where it should have revealed itself. It didn't. What they found instead were multiple gene variants, scattered across the genome, that were slightly more common in left-handers. Individually, each variant made only the tiniest difference. Together, they pointed to something unexpected, the scaffolding of the brain itself. Several of these gene variants were involved in how microtubules form and organize. Microtubules are part of the cell's internal skeleton, helping neurons grow and connect. Subtle changes here can alter the architecture of white matter, the long insulated wiring that links different brain regions. When the researchers overlaid the genetics with MRI scans, a pattern emerged. Left-handed participants showed, on average, slightly different connectivity between regions involved in language, especially in the left and right hemispheres. The physics of the brain's wiring, the little bridges linking the two sides, were not quite the same. This didn't mean that all left-handers have identical brains, or that right-handers are all wired one way. It did suggest that handedness is not just about which hand you write with. It's entangled with how your brain grows its networks, how information flows between regions, particularly those that handle language and complex planning. But even this insight came with a warning label. These are correlations. The gene variants influence brain structure. Brain structure is associated with hand preference. None of that means the genes cause left-handedness in the simple, direct way we once imagined. It's more like a statistical nudge in a vast developmental process that remains largely opaque. When scientists get stuck on humans, they often turn to animals for comparison. Cats, dogs, parrots, even fish can show something like handedness, what researchers call pawedness, or lateralized behavior. Give a cat a toy and watch which paw it bats with first over many trials. Some cats are clearly left-pawed, others right-pawed. Parrots tend to prefer one foot when holding food. Even certain species of toad favor one side when they lunge at prey. These patterns tell us that having a dominant side is not uniquely human. Brains, whether avian, mammalian, or amphibian, seem to find it useful to specialize, to let one hemisphere or the other take charge of specific tasks. What is unusual about humans is not that we have handedness, but that we agree on which hand. In most animals, the split hovers near 50-50. One individual may be left-pawed, another right-pawed, but the population doesn't lean heavily in one direction. In humans, it does. Roughly 9 out of 10 people, across cultures and continents, end up functionally right-handed. That kind of population-wide bias is rare in the animal kingdom. Why? No one knows for sure. One idea is that once a particular direction became common, once most tools, gestures, and cooperative tasks began to favor the right hand, natural selection started to reinforce that pattern. Brains that aligned with the majority might have found it easier to learn, to share tools, to coordinate movements in groups. Another idea flips the question around. Maybe what's special is not the right-handed majority, but the stable, stubborn minority. Perhaps evolution doesn't want 100% of anything. A small number of brains wired differently, left-handed, cross-dominant, ambidextrous, might add flexibility, new strategies, unexpected solutions. That brings us to a quieter, more statistical mystery. Is the proportion of left-handers itself changing? If you look at data from before the mid-20th century, the world appears almost entirely right-handed. Old-school registers, military records, and medical notes list tiny numbers of left-handers, often just 2 or 3%. Then something odd happens. From the 1960s onward, the reported percentage of left-handers begins to climb. In birth cohorts from the 1910s and 1920s, only a few percent identify as left-handed. In people born after the 1960s and 1970s, the proportion rises into the high single digits, then the low teens. Modern surveys in many countries settle somewhere around 10 to 12%. Did evolution suddenly decide to mint more left-handers in the second half of the 20th century? Almost certainly not. What changed was stigma, and with it, reporting. As the social pressure to switch hands eased, teachers no longer slapping rulers across knuckles, parents less insistent that children write the proper way, more people were able to use their natural preference openly. Older generations who had been forcibly retrained often recorded themselves as right-handed, even if their early childhood behavior told a different story. Younger generations could simply be what they were. When researchers correct for these generational effects, the picture shifts. Instead of a dramatic evolutionary surge, we see something more like a long, hidden constant. The underlying biological tendency toward left-handedness seems to have been hovering at roughly the same frequency for a long time. What moved was our willingness to see it. If genetics and population surveys raise puzzles, the links to mental health add another layer of complexity. For decades, scattered studies reported that left-handedness, or more broadly non-right-handedness, was slightly more common in people diagnosed with certain psychiatric conditions, especially schizophrenia. Some research hinted at modest differences in rates of depression or anxiety as well. It was easy from the outside to leap from slight statistical correlation to left-handers are more vulnerable. But the reality is much less tidy. Later, larger studies found that any associations tend to be weak, inconsistent, and often entangled with other variables: birth complications, early developmental issues, social stress, and the very categories researchers choose when dividing people into left, right, and mixed. There are also hints of the opposite, that whatever brain asymmetries underlie left-handedness might confer subtle advantages in certain kinds of thinking, such as divergent problem-solving, or resilience in the face of specific injuries. The same rearranged wiring that makes a brain less typical may, in some contexts, make it more adaptable. Most scientists today are careful. Handedness and mental health are related only in complicated, indirect ways, if at all. Left-handedness does not cause schizophrenia or anxiety or depression. Instead, there may be overlapping developmental pathways, subtle differences in how the two sides of the brain share work, that, under some conditions, tilt risk a little this way or that. That uncertainty opens an older, quieter question. Is left-handedness a mistake that evolution has failed to weed out? Or is it a feature, a kind of built-in neurodiversity that helps a species weather an unpredictable world? Think back to that sports advantage, the surprise of facing an uncommon guard or an unexpected curveball. Now imagine that spread across other domains. A small minority of people whose brains slice problems at unusual angles, whose language networks are wired just a little differently, who notice patterns others overlook or approach tools, gestures, and collaborations in unorthodox ways. In a stable environment, that might not matter much. In times of rapid change, new technologies, new climates, new social structures, those outlier strategies could become crucial. Perhaps the persistence of left-handedness at roughly 10% is not a glitch, but a compromise. Too many, and coordination becomes harder. Tools and traditions lose their standardization. Too few, and the species loses a reservoir of alternative wiring. For now, that remains speculation. But it is the kind of speculation that guides the next wave of research. On the horizon are genomic studies even larger than the Oxford work, pulling in millions of participants from around the world, not just Europe. These can look not just for single genes, but for patterns of thousands of tiny variants working together, and for how those patterns interact with environment, birth conditions, early injuries, education, culture. At the same time, brain imaging is becoming more refined. Instead of static pictures, we can now watch networks activate and coordinate in real time, mapping how left and right-handers recruit different regions for language, music, spatial tasks, or emotion. Longitudinal studies can follow children from infancy, before they show any clear hand preference, through the years when that preference solidifies, tracking how the brain's asymmetries unfold. Researchers are also widening their view, comparing human-handedness with lateralization in other species more systematically. Corvids solving puzzles, octopuses choosing tentacles, chimpanzees using tools. Somewhere in those mirrors may lie the clues to why our own bias became so extreme. Will all of this eventually explain why roughly 1 in 10 humans is left-handed? Probably not in the form of a single satisfying sentence. The emerging picture suggests something more like a tapestry. Genes that influence cellular scaffolding, brains that wire their language and motor systems with tiny asymmetries, cultures that push those tendencies one way or another, and the slow, stubborn hand of evolution keeping a minority trait in play. What we are learning, as the data accumulates, is not that left-handers shouldn't exist, but that their existence is woven deeply into what it means to be human, a species defined not by perfect symmetry, but by organized imbalance. And somewhere behind the numbers and brain scans, behind the curves of chromosomes and microtubules, there is a longer story, one that stretches back through fossilized footprints and stone tools into the deep prehistory, where the first faint preference for one hand over the other began to emerge. So we end where we began, with something very small and very ordinary. A hand. Not a glacier, not a supervolcano, not a mass extinction. Just the quiet fact that when you reach for a pen or a spoon or the light switch in the dark, you tend to reach with the same side every time. Across this whole journey, from stone tools chipped in half-light caves, to scribes bending awkwardly over right-to-left scripts, to medieval teachers rapping the wrong hand, to MRI machines humming softly in hospital basements, we've watched left-handedness do the same thing over and over, refuse to go away. Priests called it sinful. Physicians called it pathological. Parents called it a phase to be corrected. Modern scientists gave it new names: non-right-handedness, atypical lateralization, and pointed magnets and equations at it. And yet, whenever you count carefully at any time in any place, there it is again, a stubborn 1 in 10, more or less. It bends under pressure. It hides. It learns to write with the right hand while still throwing with the left. It changes its public face on school forms and military records. But underneath, in the quiet circuits of the nervous system, in the slow dance of genes and growing neurons, the pattern persists. Maybe that's the real answer hiding inside the paradox of why left-handed people shouldn't exist but still do. Maybe evolution is not trying to iron us flat, to make every brain and every gesture perfectly symmetrical. Maybe it keeps a little asymmetry in reserve, a small predictable minority whose minds are wired just off-centre from the majority. Not as a mistake, but as a hedge. A way of storing flexibility inside the species itself. If that's true, even as a possibility, then left-handedness stops being a defect to explain away and becomes something quieter and more poetic. A reminder, written into motor cortex and microtubules, that human diversity is not a problem to be solved. It is the method, the strategy, the way we survive strange futures we can't yet imagine. So if you're left-handed or mixed-handed, or you grew up being nudged to switch, you are part of that long, fragile, resilient thread stretching back through time. If you're right-handed, you carry it too in your ancestry, in your shared circuitry with people who do things backwards from you. Before you drift off, I'd love to hear where you are in that story. If you found this interesting, it helps a lot if you tap like, and if you want more Sleepy History dives into odd corners of the past, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In the comments, tell me 2 things: where in the world you're listening from tonight, and whether you're left-handed, right-handed, or something in between. And if your mind is still awake and wandering back toward deep time, toward bottlenecks and vanished cousins and the first experiments evolution ran with our species, there's a whole book waiting for you. It's a gentle tour through the prehistoric secrets we touched on in this episode, written in the same slow, story-like style you've been hearing. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, though, you can let the questions rest. Hands folded or tucked under a pillow left or right, the minority endures, and so do you.